Beneath the towering pyramids and golden masks, something quieter made Egypt remarkable. Not just pharaohs or tombs, but habits, systems, daily rituals. The way they measured time by floodwater, the way bread and beer moved from field to mouth without collapsing an empire, the scribes who never raised their voices, and the bricklayers who built without blueprints, but with perfect balance. Tonight, we're not looking for secrets buried in gold. We're listening for footsteps across packed earth, for ink scratched on clay, for quiet stars over a desert clock. And if you enjoy slowly drifting through history like this, consider subscribing for more. And leave a comment. What's your favorite forgotten invention of the ancient world? Let's begin. When you think of ancient Egypt, you may picture dry desert winds, monumental statues, or golden tombs sealed for millennia. But long before the tombs, before the dynasties hardened into stone, there was the Nile, rising, falling, and returning again, year after year, without fail. The ancient Egyptians didn't just live by the river. They listened to it. They studied its breath. And over time, they built their entire calendar around its moods. In a world without clocks, without printed calendars, and without precise star charts, the Nile was their most accurate timekeeper. Its annual flood, called the inundation, or Akhet, was not feared, but welcomed. When the river rose in late summer, it did not destroy, it transformed. Dry farmland was submerged, coated in black silt, and made fertile again. The flood was not a disruption, it was a reset. The Egyptians marked the beginning of each year not by the moon, nor by the solstice, but by the rising of the star Sirius, which they called Sopdet. When Sirius rose just before dawn, just above the eastern horizon, it foretold the coming of the flood. The river followed soon after. This alignment was so reliable that it formed the anchor of Egypt's civil calendar, long before mechanical timepieces were even imagined. And the calendar itself was simple, but efficient. 3 seasons, 4 months per season, 30 days per month, and 5 extra festival days added to round out the year. These 3 seasons mirrored the rhythm of the Nile Akhet, the season of flooding, when work shifted from the fields to maintenance and temple rituals. Pare, the season of emergence, when waters receded and planting began. Shemu, the season of harvest and dryness, when crops were collected and preparations began anew. This structure didn't just guide farming, it shaped taxes, religious festivals, work schedules, and even marriages. The entire country moved in harmony with a river that never paused. Yet this neat order masked a deeper complexity, because the Nile did not always flood the same way. Some years, the river rose higher. Other years, it barely spilled beyond its banks. The difference between abundance and famine could be a single meter of water. Priests and farmers alike studied the flow, sometimes from observation towers known as nilometers, stone shafts or staircases carved with markings to measure the river's rise. Some nilometers were humble, built alongside temple walls. Others, like the one at Elephantine Island, were architectural statements, half science, half devotion. And from these measurements, forecasts were made. A high flood meant surplus grain. A low flood meant harder years ahead. Temple scribes recorded the height and predicted harvests. The pharaoh's advisors used these measurements to plan state, rations, and allocate labor. A good year meant royal building projects could move forward. A poor year meant grain reserves were unlocked and distributed from state storehouses. But the Nile's rhythm also governed the spiritual. The floodwaters, dark and silt-heavy, were seen as a gift from the gods, especially Hapi, the deity of the inundation. Hapi was not a fearsome god. He was generous, blue-skinned, with offerings of lotus and papyrus, sometimes depicted with androgynous features and a swollen belly, a symbol of fertility and abundance. Temples along the river held ceremonies of thanks, not to command the river, but to honor its cycle. Yet behind these, Rituals lay a profound sense of dependence. The Egyptians were expert planners, builders, and record keepers, but they could not control the Nile, and they knew it. The calendar helped them prepare. The temples gave them comfort. But when the river changed course, rose too fast, or stayed too still, there was little to be done. Even the most powerful pharaoh was a servant of the flood. This relationship between humans and a semi-predictable natural force shaped Egyptian culture in subtle ways. It made time feel circular, not linear. The year turned, but always came back. The river rose, and then it fell. The dead were buried facing the west, where the sun vanished each evening, not in fear, but in expectation that it would rise again. And this cyclical view of time found its way into everything: farming, politics, worship, and writing. The scribes, who wrote on clay tablets and papyrus scrolls, often recorded events not with dates as we know them, but as occurring in year X of the reign of King so-and-so, in the season of Perez, in the month of Mashir. Time was rooted, not in absolute numbers, but in placement within the river's cycle. What mattered was not the number, but the context. Was it before the harvest, after the flood, during planting? In that way, the Egyptian calendar was not just a tool, it was a worldview. But even as the calendar stabilized, reality often defied its order. Sometimes the serious rising arrived earlier than the flood. Sometimes it arrived later. Drought years came, especially during transitions of dynasties or after volcanic eruptions far from Egypt's borders. Famine followed. Grain prices spiked, trade faltered. Priests adjusted rituals to account for absent water. Temple records from some periods include offerings to restore the flood, suggesting both prayer and desperation. And yet, the people adjusted. They measured again. They waited. Because beneath all their knowledge, there remained one truth. Time flowed with the river. But what happened when the river no longer matched the stars? When the calendar continued, but the water failed to come? When the river failed to rise, the calendar did not stop. Priests still read dates from carved stone. Farmers still traced planting seasons with sticks in the dirt. Temples still held festivals. But everything felt off. The time was correct, and yet the world was out of rhythm. This dissonance was not abstract. It was physical. The soil stayed dry. Seeds shriveled. Oxen dragged wooden plows across dust instead of mud. And as weeks passed without water, tension grew quietly, but palpably in every district. Egypt's population, especially in the Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom periods, was largely rural. The vast majority lived in small villages, tucked between the desert and the floodplain. These communities relied directly on the annual inundation. Without it, wells dried, cisterns emptied. People resorted to drawing water from stagnant pools. Illness followed. In official records, drought years were rarely described in emotional terms. The scribes who managed the annals of the pharaohs preferred precision. One entry might read, "In the 8th year of the reign of Djetkare-Isesi, the waters did not rise beyond the lower mark. No mourning, no panic, just fact." But the consequences were enormous. Taxes were assessed based on expected harvests. When grain yields dropped, so did royal revenue. Local officials had to revise their quotas. In some cases, the shortfall was forgiven. In others, it was not. Tomb inscriptions from provincial governors include phrases like, "He lessened the grain burden in hard years," or "He did not seize cattle during the low flood." Mercy then became a recorded virtue, but there was no central disaster plan. Each region responded as it could. Some drew from royal granaries, others relied on local nobles or wealthy temples to provide emergency rations. These distributions were not always fair. Records suggest that those with connections received more. Peasants at the edge of the system often suffered in silence. Still, the government watched. The curatores aquarum, stewards of the water, tracked the flow carefully. If a nilometer remained low, letters were sent. Stone-carved correspondence from one period includes orders to dig new canals, clear debris, and restore irrigation dikes. These efforts were modest attempts to supplement nature. They helped sometimes, but they could not create rain. They could not summon a flood, and the priests, too, acted. Temple ceremonies were intensified. Offerings to Hapi grew more elaborate. In some temples, statues were carried through the streets, their faces painted with serene expressions, their feet draped in garlands of papyrus and reeds. Chants filled the halls. Smoke from incense curled upward toward the high ceiling beams. It is tempting to see these rituals as magical thinking, but for the Egyptians, they were acts of alignment. The calendar and the flood were supposed to match. When they didn't, something, anything, had to bridge the gap. Still, over time, the system evolved. By the New Kingdom, the Egyptians had developed more flexible methods of managing dry years. Irrigation channels were widened. Basin systems were improved. Farmers built shaddufs, long wooden levers with counterweights used to lift water from low canals into fields. These could extend farming viability even when the flood underperformed. But they required labor, and labor in Egypt meant administration. Work crews were assigned. Scribes counted men, recorded their tasks, and listed tools. One preserved. Ostrakon, a scrap of pottery used for quick notes, includes a tally. 17 men, 2 shaddufs, rope damaged, water short. This is not the voice of a historian. It is the voice of someone simply trying to move water from one place to another. Still, many historians believe that long-term droughts contributed to periods of instability. During the first intermediate period, when centralized power weakened and multiple claimants fought for control, some scholars point to environmental factors. Letters and tomb inscriptions from this time mention famines and migrations. Entire villages may have been abandoned when the flood failed repeatedly. And yet, the calendar rolled on. It was never adjusted for these discrepancies. The Egyptian civil calendar remained 365 days long, without a leap year correction. Over time, it drifted against the solar year by 1 day every 4 years. This meant that eventually, festivals would fall in the wrong season. The Sirius rising would no longer align with the first day of Akhet. The calendar was no longer synced with the sky. But the Egyptians, once again, adapted. They layered calendars, one for the civil year, one for agriculture, and one for religious ceremonies. Priests used astronomical observations to determine the correct day for certain rituals, regardless of the official calendar. Farmers trusted the river more than the date, and state scribes simply kept writing. This approach was not rigid, it was resilient. Rather than force the system to match the heavens, the Egyptians allowed their records, rituals, and routines to flex. Time became something practical, not purely cosmic, a tool for managing labor, resources, and expectations. Even still, some tried to predict better. Priests at major temples, especially Heliopolis, a center of astronomical study, recorded stellar movements, hoping to refine their forecasts. They tracked planetary positions, lunar phases, and eclipses. Some combined this data with historical flood levels, looking for patterns. But without modern tools, their models were only partly successful. Others turned to omens. In the villages, people looked to the behavior of animals, the thickness of lotus leaves, the migration of birds. None of this was codified, but it became part of the rhythm. Signs, hunches, the soft knowledge of long familiarity with a place. And always, the same question hovered. Would the flood return next year? This question wasn't just agricultural. It was emotional, psychological. It shaped how people thought about risk, about security, about the gods and the king. Because when the river failed, it wasn't just nature that was questioned. It was the entire structure of time. By the time of the later dynasties, the ancient Egyptian relationship with the Nile flood had become a blend of precision and patience. The calendar remained, with all its small imperfections. The river still rose, though not always predictably. And the people, scribes, priests, farmers, governors, continued to move through time not with control, but with expectation. They did not expect the flood to be perfect. They expected it to return. That expectation shaped every layer of Egyptian life. When a child was born, the likely month of harvest was discussed. When a marriage was arranged, the expected flood height was factored into dowry terms. When a pharaoh died, burial ceremonies aligned with the Nile's descent, so that mourning passed with the water's slow retreat. Over centuries, inscriptions continued to reflect this mindset. On the walls of tombs and temples, symbols of water and time are carved side by side. A boat gliding along a carved river, a calendar glyph paired with a basket of grain, a scribe's hand holding a reed pen hovering above a date. All of these were reminders that time was not separate from nature. It was embedded in it. But the Nile's behavior also revealed an enduring truth. Systems are always approximations. No calendar can fully match a river. No civil year can anticipate the mood of water and weather. And the Egyptians remarkably accepted that. They did not reform the calendar to fit new celestial measurements. They didn't abandon their rituals when dates drifted. Instead, they adjusted around the flaws. Their priests recalibrated festivals using lunar cycles. Their astronomers recorded anomalies. Their scribes continued their scrolls, sometimes noting discrepancies, often not. What mattered was continuity, not precision. A good calendar was not one that always matched the sky, but one that people could trust. One that guided planting. One that signaled harvest. One that framed life's turning points. Birth, marriage, mourning, offering. Even when that calendar slipped, the people remained anchored by the pattern it offered. The Nile, too, changed with time. In later centuries, as upstream agriculture expanded, the strength of the flood began to decline. More water was diverted. Deforestation in southern regions altered rainfall patterns. Sediment accumulated in canals. Floods became muddier, more variable. The once predictable rhythm faltered, and yet, Egyptian records from this time do not mourn the shift. They adapt. New floodgates are constructed. Irrigation networks are repaired and extended. More shadufs are built. Wells are dug deeper. Temples continue to hold rituals for happy, though the tone becomes more cautious, more pleading. Some inscriptions note strange phenomena. A second flood, late in the year. A dry akhet, followed by an early rain. These are not marked as disasters. They are treated as signs, data, something to watch. This slow flexibility allowed Egyptian society to endure. When other civilizations collapsed under sudden environmental shocks, Egypt bent. It did not break. Even during the Roman occupation, when Egypt became a province, the local flood system remained largely intact. Roman officials learned to monitor nilometers. They issued grain quotas based on flood levels. They retained Egyptian experts and relied on Egyptian labor. The old system proved useful and continued long after its creators were gone. Today, some of those nilometers still exist, carved in stone, worn smooth by centuries of hands and water. They are monuments not to kings or gods, but to observation. A single mark, one notch higher or lower, could change an entire year's plan, could adjust taxes, could mean the difference between surplus and scarcity, and yet those small marks were enough. No machines, no satellites, no global models, just a shaft, a stair, and a record, a system built not for speed, but for endurance. In modern times, the Nile is now tamed. Dams have blocked its flood. Cities have paved over its floodplains. The ancient calendar no longer applies. And yet, the rhythm still echoes. In Egypt, time is still spoken of in seasons. The memory of Akhet, Pere, and Shemu lingers in agricultural vocabulary. Farmers still watch the river, still study the soil, still begin their work at dawn with the same quiet care. And historians, reading fragments of scrolls, carved stones, and faded wall paintings, still marvel at a society that tethered its very concept of time to the breath of a river. What the Egyptians knew, and what modern civilization sometimes forgets, is that time is not only something you count, it is something you watch, something you wait for, something that arrives not by your command, but on its own terms. Their genius was not in predicting the Nile perfectly, it was in preparing for its return. And perhaps that's the quiet lesson, beneath all the stone and gold. That the most advanced system is not the one that measures with accuracy, but the one that endures without it. In the shadow of temples and tombs, far from the grandeur of pyramids and royal avenues, ancient Egypt was mostly built by hand, with mud, straw, and the slow rhythm of careful planning. The towering monuments may have captured history's gaze, but it was the modest mud brick village that truly defined how people lived. Most Egyptians never saw the inside of a palace or temple. They were farmers, craftsmen, weavers and bakers, clustered in compact settlements spread across the narrow band of arable land along the Nile. And nearly everything they built, homes, granaries, workshops, walls, was made from the same humble material, mud brick. The Nile itself provided the recipe. After each inundation, silt-rich soil remained along the river's banks, mixed with chopped straw and water. This earth could be shaped into bricks and left to dry beneath the sun. No firing, no kilns, just patience. The process was deeply local. Each village had its own mixture, slightly different proportions of silt and straw, depending on what was available. Molds were used to keep bricks uniform in size. In many communities, families produced their own bricks, stacking them in neat rows on reed mats and covering them during unexpected rain. In others, brickmakers offered services in exchange for grain or cloth. But mud brick was not primitive, it was adaptable, and Egyptian builders, often working without blueprints, showed remarkable knowledge of load-bearing weight, drainage, airflow, and insulation. Most homes were single-story. Some included a rooftop platform used for sleeping. During warm nights or drying herbs and vegetables, doorways were carefully shaped to prevent collapse, and many houses included small windows set high in the wall to allow light while keeping out dust and wind. Thick walls retained coolness. Narrow alleyways between houses encouraged shade and air circulation. Measurements were taken using the cubit, a unit roughly equal to the length of a forearm, standardized over time into an official royal cubit of about 52.3 centimeters. Wooden cubit rods have been found in tombs and workshops, often carved with subdivisions for half, third, and quarter cubits. These simple tools allowed for precise and repeatable design. But precision didn't mean rigidity. Egyptian village architecture evolved organically. Houses were added onto as families grew, courtyards were shared, paths meandered. And while major cities like Thebes or Memphis had grid plans in ceremonial districts, rural villages followed a slower logic. Build where the ground is dry, where the sun is gentle, where the work is near. What emerges from archaeological sites like Deir el-Medina and Tel el-Amarna is not randomness, but intentional adaptation. Walls were rebuilt after collapse. Roofs were layered with new straw. Drainage channels were redirected. Nothing was permanent, but everything had a purpose, and maintenance was continuous. Mud brick, for all its advantages, is vulnerable. It erodes in rain, cracks in heat. So households developed regular routines, patching walls after storms, reinforcing corners before flood season, sweeping loose dust from doorways. It wasn't just labor, it was tradition. Parents taught children how to spot a weak spot in a wall, how to mix mortar, how to press new bricks without bubbles. Sometimes entire sections of a village would be rebuilt every few decades. In archaeological strata, these rebuildings appear as layered foundations, each generation placing its life just above the last. Tools dropped in the process, a chipped knife, a reed pen, a broken jar, end up sealed beneath new floors, unintentionally preserved. Granaries and storage sheds were also carefully constructed. Round or oval in shape, often built with tapered walls and covered with conical roofs of thatch or plaster. These small silos kept grain dry and safe from rodents. Raised thresholds kept out floodwater. Many were communal, with notched markings indicating division between families or households. Water was equally critical. Villages located closer to the river used wells or canals. Others relied on rainwater, cisterns, simple depressions lined with clay to trap seasonal rain. Some homes had clay jars placed beneath eaves to catch runoff. Potters created water jars with narrow necks to minimize evaporation. A cracked vessel meant more than inconvenience. It disrupted the rhythm of drinking, bathing, cooking, cleaning. These rhythms were not written down. They were observed, passed on. A boy might learn to repair a wall by watching his mother mix the plaster. A girl might carry bricks for a neighbor's home before building her own. There were no architects, in the modern sense. There were skilled hands, trusted judgment, and the quiet consensus of a village that knew how to make space without waste. Even within homes, layout reflected understanding. The main living space was often at the front, used for eating, working, or hosting visitors. Behind that came storage areas or sleeping chambers. In some homes, a simple bench was molded into the wall for sitting or placing objects. Painted decoration was rare, but some walls were smoothed and polished with limestone wash, or etched with simple lines or spirals. These weren't showpieces. They were signs of care. Wealthier homes had more rooms, sometimes even a second floor. But even in modest dwellings, the attention to airflow, shade, and balance suggests a lived experience of heat and dust, wind and flood. Egyptian builders didn't build for centuries. They built for seasons. And when a structure wore out, it wasn't mourned. It was replaced. Better, smoother, more suited to the now. But how did these quiet engineers manage community space? How did a village decide where to expand and where to stop? In a land ruled by pharaohs and lined with monuments, village planning might seem like an afterthought. But in Egypt's mud brick settlements, the layout of homes, walkways, granaries, and wells wasn't random. It was the result of collaboration, observation, and quiet agreements passed through generations. Unlike the formal symmetry of palatial compounds or temple courtyards, village expansion in Egypt was incremental. A family needed more space. A brother married. A storehouse grew full. And so, a new room was added. A wall was shifted. A neighbor's courtyard extended slightly, making room for both growth and respect. There were no formal property deeds in most rural areas, but boundaries were understood, not by maps, but by memory. Elders recalled which line of bricks had marked a corner 3 floods ago. Children learned where their family's stretch of wall met the neighbor's goat pen. Encroachment wasn't settled by courts. It was negotiated over grain or in the shade of a fig tree. This method worked in part because of space constraints. The cultivable land along the Nile was narrow, squeezed between river and desert. Villages couldn't expand indefinitely. They folded inwards. Courtyards became shared spaces. Walls were rebuilt, not to separate, but to support adjoining homes. One person's roof might serve as another's floor. And because mud brick was easy to shape, boundaries were soft, literally and socially. But this did not mean disorder. It meant flexibility. In places like Deir el-Medina, a well-preserved village of artisans near the Valley of the Kings, archaeologists have found straight streets, consistent house sizes, and coordinated water access. This wasn't spontaneous. It was communal engineering, carried out by laborers, not lords. Deir el-Medina is unique in that it housed state-sponsored workers, craftsmen who carved and decorated royal tombs. Their homes were more uniform than most villages, but the principles they followed reflect broader Egyptian practices. Each house was narrow, often 2 or 3 rooms deep, aligned along a main lane. Doorways opened directly onto the street. Within, rooms were laid out with consistency. An entrance hall, a central living space, a small rear chamber for storage or sleeping, and sometimes a staircase to the roof. Floors were packed earth. Walls were whitewashed. Niches were carved to hold oil lamps or religious icons. While the structure was modest, the functionality was impressive. Every space had a use. Ventilation shafts provided airflow. Floors were sloped to direct water away during cleaning or rain. Drainage was rudimentary but effective. Small channels cut through stone thresholds, leading outside or towards sunken collection pits. Some homes even had underground waste disposal pits, lined with stone and occasionally emptied, though not often enough to spare the archaeologists. These systems weren't coordinated by overseers or architects. They were coordinated by neighbors. One home could only build a channel if the next house allowed space. A stairwell couldn't be added unless the roof it touched could bear the weight. These decisions required conversation, not command, and in that way, Egyptian villages reflected a quiet form of engineering consensus, shared, not imposed. In larger towns, where populations were denser, zoning became more visible. Markets formed near central wells or temple walls. Bakeries clustered along shared ovens. Pottery workshops sat downwind. These arrangements reduced fire risk and smoke exposure. Paths were widened in high-traffic areas. Thresholds were raised, where floodwater collected. But even in small hamlets, design adapted to natural patterns. Builders studied how light moved across walls, how wind whistled through alleys, how water gathered after storms. They placed entrances to the east to capture morning light but avoid the worst of the afternoon heat. Roofs were sloped not for style, but to shed rain more easily. Exterior walls were thickened against seasonal sandstorms. There's a humility in these choices, a recognition that climate, not vanity, should shape construction. This is clearest in the way Egyptians rebuilt. After every major flood, or after fire, theft, or disrepair, structures were torn down, but their foundations reused. Some villages, like Tel el-Daba or Qom el-Hisn, show dozens of rebuilding layers, stacked like soft sediment. Archaeologists digging these sites encounter ancient staircases that lead to missing floors, doorways buried beneath new walls, thresholds smoothed by centuries of feet. These layers tell stories not of kings, but of households. One layer might show the footprint of a granary, later repurposed as a workshop, then leveled and topped with a home. A family grew, shifted work, adjusted. No inscription records this change. But the bricks remember, and every generation had to work with what came before. Sometimes that meant adjusting to a crooked foundation. Other times, it meant preserving a corner wall out of respect or obligation. In some cases, ancestors' homes were left intact, within new ones, forming sanctified interior rooms or ritual spaces. The past was not erased. It was folded in. This layering had practical benefits too. The compacted layers elevated homes above previous flood levels. They added insulation. They reduced the need for new materials. And they created a visual archive of resilience. Even the materials tell this story. Bricks reused from older buildings are identifiable by their straw content. Older straw darkens and fragments more easily. Some homes include bricks with visible fingerprints from when they were shaped by hand centuries earlier. These are not the artifacts of famous builders. They are the fingerprints of neighbors, and in their own quiet way, these builders advanced a kind of wisdom that's still admired. Build small, build smart, build again. But how did Egypt's village builders balance fragility with permanence? What did they choose to leave behind? And what did they carry forward? To understand what ancient Egyptian village builders valued most, you only have to look at what they were willing to leave behind and what they chose to rebuild. Their architecture was not made to last forever. It was made to adapt, to survive the season, the flood, the fire, and begin again. This, in itself, was a form of engineering. The mud brick house was not permanent, but it was resilient, and that resilience came from its ease of renewal. A collapsed wall did not signal loss, it signaled a task. Mix more clay, add straw, mold, dry, replace. The process could begin the same day, sometimes with help from neighbors. In a climate where stone was precious and labor costly, mud brick was democracy. Every person could repair their own shelter, and this led to a culture of constant care. Houses were not sacred spaces in the way temples were, but they were repositories of memory. A corner smoothed by generations of backs leaning against it. A threshold grooved by sandals. A crack patched each spring with slightly different clay. The house changed as the people did. And those changes were neither hidden nor mourned. They were lived. But some elements of village construction were built to endure. Among the most carefully constructed features were granaries. These often stood slightly apart from homes, raised on stone or brick platforms to protect against rats and water. Their thick walls and narrow entrances kept grain dry and relatively cool, and some included air holes placed at precise angles for ventilation. A full granary was a sign of stability. An empty one meant uncertainty. Granaries were often communal, managed by extended families, village elders, or sometimes local temple authorities. Tokens were used to measure withdrawals. Clay seals marked lids. These systems, simple in appearance, relied on trust and accountability, and where grain was stored, measurement mattered. The cubit remained central, used not only for walls and rooms, but also for estimating harvests and recording deliveries. In some sites, measuring rods have been found buried alongside scribes or overseers, suggesting their role was prestigious. Other tools included corded ropes for longer measurements and marked baskets for volume. These methods weren't precise in modern terms, but they were consistent. And in ancient systems, consistency was more valuable than accuracy. If everyone agreed that a basket meant a certain portion, and if that portion was repeatable, the system worked. Markets could operate, payments could be recorded, labor could be divided. Labor itself was an architectural force. During the flood season, when fields were submerged, many villagers turned their hands to building projects, repairing homes, expanding storage, reinforcing walls. This seasonal labor cycle helped distribute effort and preserved skills. Children observed, teenagers assisted. By adulthood, nearly every villager knew how to lay a course of bricks, how to measure a beam, how to prepare a site. This distributed knowledge was powerful. It created continuity without institutions. There were no construction academies, no standardized manuals. The instruction was oral, tactile, rhythmic, and it produced results that endured far longer than expected. At sites like Cahun and Elephantine, foundations of homes built 3,000 years ago still trace the lines of courtyards, storage rooms, and wells. These weren't elite villas. They were everyday dwellings. Their survival is not due to special materials, but to thoughtful placement, repeated repair, and a design philosophy rooted in balance, not scale. Even when stone was used, it was used sparingly. Door lintels, thresholds, and corner blocks were sometimes reinforced with limestone. This helped stabilize key points while preserving the economy of mud brick elsewhere. When a house collapsed, these stones were often salvaged and reused, sometimes centuries later, fitted into new buildings like puzzle pieces from forgotten structures. The idea that nothing was wasted runs deep in Egyptian village life. Broken pots were used as fill. Cracked bricks were reshaped. Even human waste at times was composted or repurposed as fertilizer. Builders worked with what they had, not because they were poor, but because they saw resources as circular, not disposable. This philosophy extended to space. In many villages, courtyards served multiple roles: open-air kitchens, sleeping spaces, places for drying laundry, storing tools, mending clothes, preparing bread. These spaces were alive, and as families grew or shrank, the courtyards shifted. A wall might be added, a shade cloth strung, a platform raised for pigeons. No drawing marked the change. The change simply occurred. Villages also had sacred corners. Even in humble homes, small niches were carved to hold images of household gods or ancestors. These spaces might contain a tiny figurine, a clay dish of incense, or a simple painted offering. They were reminders that life wasn't just physical. It was layered with time, memory, spirit. And when a house was abandoned, these niches were sometimes preserved, built into the next home, painted over, but not destroyed. This subtle layering of space and time is part of what makes Egyptian village architecture so remarkable. It was not timeless. It was timeful, full of change, full of marks left by the present, acknowledged by the future. When archaeologists uncover these homes today, they find not perfection, but persistence. Walls that lean slightly, thresholds chipped, bricks crumbling, but also footprints in floors, soot marks from long-vanished fires, pottery shards near what was once a cooking hearth. These are not failures of architecture. They are signs of life lived well. The greatness of Egyptian engineering does not lie only in its pyramids. It lies in the way its people measured a cubit, mixed a brick, shaped a room, and did it again, year after year. Not for glory, not for history books, but for shelter, for food, for family, for function. And in that quiet repetition, they built something far more impressive than stone. They built a culture of resilience, one mud brick at a time. The pyramids of Giza rise with a kind of mathematical certainty, massive, smooth-edged monuments that seem almost too precise for their age. For centuries, their construction has inspired questions, speculation, even myth. But far from the laser beams and aliens of modern imagination, the true miracle wasn't what built them. It was who built them. And even more remarkably, what those people ate. Behind every block lifted, every sled dragged, and every limestone face polished, there was food. Ordinary, heavy, sustaining food. Bread, beer, onions, and dried fish. These were the real pillars of the Pyramid Age. Most laborers on the pyramid projects were not slaves, but paid workers, conscripted or rotational laborers from across Egypt's villages. The Greek historian Herodotus may have exaggerated when he claimed 100,000 men built the Great Pyramid. Modern estimates suggest a more stable workforce of around 20,000 to 30,000, rotating in and out depending on the season. And feeding these thousands of workers was not guesswork, it was bureaucracy. Excavations at sites near Giza, like the workers' village at Hayt el Ghurab, reveal a sophisticated system of provisioning. Mud brick storage rooms, massive bakeries, and butchering areas show that meals were not improvised, they were industrial. Scribes recorded deliveries, overseers monitored rations, herds of cattle, flocks of geese, and boatloads of grain were tracked like shipments to a warehouse. The most common rations, bread and beer. Bread was made from emmer wheat and barley, ground daily on grinding stones by teams of women. The flour was coarse, full of grit from the stone itself. Mixed with water and sometimes a bit of honey or date paste, it was baked in conical clay molds over open fires. The resulting loaves were dense, often hard, but calorically rich. Beer, meanwhile, was not hopped or fizzy. It was thick, soupy, and sometimes chewed as much as drunk. Brewed from partially baked loaves, soaked in water and left to ferment, it provided hydration and nutrition in one murky bowl. The alcohol content was low, but enough to dull the aches of lifting limestone. But this was not all. Workers were also given onions, garlic, leeks, lentils, and salted fish. In some layers of the workers' camp, remains of beef and goat bones have been found, suggesting that while ordinary laborers received basic fare, overseers or skilled workers had access to better meals. It was a food hierarchy shaped not by luxury, but by labor role. Rations were standardized. Inscriptions and papyri describe exact quantities of bread per day, the expected amount of beer per laborer, and how much grain a household could claim. One surviving document, the Wilbur Papyrus, lists land allotments and agricultural yields tied directly to food distribution. It reads not like literature, but like a spreadsheet scratched into papyrus. Food, in this context, wasn't just sustenance. It was payment. And so, the Egyptian state developed a robust system to manage it. Fields were sown with state seed, harvested by teams organized through temple or royal officials and delivered to centralized granaries. From there, scribes calculated rations and coordinated transport by donkey, boat, or cart to building sites. This meant that pyramid construction relied as much on logistics as on engineering. Every day, grain had to be milled, dough kneaded, fires tended, jars washed, fish dried, and beer fermented, just to keep the stones moving. And it worked. The rhythm of food production was almost ritualistic. Bakers and brewers labored just as hard as masons and haulers. Their tools, grinding stones, molds, ovens, are still found by the dozens near workers' quarters. Some stones are worn smooth from years of use. Others were buried in layers of ash and husk, proof that no job site functioned without fire and flour. But food wasn't only about energy, it was about community. At the workers' village, archaeologists found traces of shared eating spaces, courtyards, where meals were likely prepared and consumed in groups. Vessels were simple, but uniform. Some larger jars were marked with crew names or symbols, suggesting organized units not only worked together, but ate together, and these crews had identity. On stone fragments, graffiti records their names. The Ao, friends of Khufu, the drunkards of Menkaura, the strong ones of the West. These weren't slaves toiling in silence. They were labor teams with pride, structure, and daily routines, anchored by food. But how did this system survive failure? What happened when the grain shipments ran late, or the beer soured in the sun? When grain shipments slowed, or supplies ran short, the entire system surrounding pyramid construction had to shift, quietly, methodically, without halting progress. The Great Pyramids were not built in a vacuum. They rose during seasonal cycles, administrative changes, and years of both plenty and shortage. And like everything in ancient Egypt, the food system adapted through organization, not improvisation. Egyptian state planning was far more advanced than most people realize. Alongside temples and tombs, it maintained a complex system of record keeping, especially around agricultural yield and ration distribution. Scribes monitored crops from field to bakery. If a harvest came in under projection, ration allocations were adjusted, not just for pyramid laborers, but for the granaries that fed them. In some cases, this meant ration reduction, less bread, thinner beer. Documents preserved from other periods in Egyptian history mention years of weak grain, in which officials revised allotments using formulas to stretch supplies without causing revolt. For instance, skilled laborers might continue to receive full rations, while general workers were rotated more frequently, reducing the daily load on provisioning. And when transport was the issue, say a grain barge delayed by a low Nile level, backup storage silos near construction sites came into play. These weren't enormous warehouses, but networks of smaller silos placed along the riverbanks or just outside worker encampments. Grain might spoil over time, but with careful sealing and regular inspection, it could last long enough to bridge seasonal gaps. At the heart of this resilience was the scribe. Scribes weren't just record keepers. They were coordinators, predictors, and troubleshooters. In modern terms, they were the logistics managers. They recorded the output of fields, calculated rations per head, tracked the wear of baking tools, and even monitored the grain-to-beer conversion ratios. Scribes were trained from a young age, often starting in temple schools, where they learned not only how to write, but how to measure and account. Writing on papyrus was expensive, so practice began on shards of pottery, ostraca, with long columns of numbers, place names, symbols, and delivery notes. These tiny fragments are a treasure trove of historical detail, often describing the very minutiae that kept projects like the pyramids moving. One ostracon might read, 20 loaves delivered to the North Crew, 3 missing. Barrel of beer returned empty, sour smell. That single line contains volumes, food quantity, spoilage report, crew name, and accountability. The delivery system was tight. Each work unit had a designated overseer who signed off on rations. Bread and beer were collected at specific intervals, daily for perishable goods, weekly or monthly for dry stores. Carts or labor teams transported these to dormitories or shared meal areas. Empty vessels were returned, counted, cleaned, and reused. When shortfalls occurred, blame was documented. If a shipment spoiled, it was attributed to the brewer or the transporter. If grain disappeared en route, an investigation might follow. In rare cases, records mention punishment, not execution or imprisonment, but demotion, reassignment, or garnished rations. Even disputes between work crews show up in graffiti and scribbled notes. One humorous entry reads, "The crew of the West. Gates stole our onions. We demand 2 baskets in return." Food wasn't just fuel, it was status, currency, and trust. Larger meals, such as festivals or milestone celebrations, were coordinated differently. For significant achievements, like the completion of a major chamber or the laying of a foundational block, workers received bonus rations, extra bread, sweeter beer, sometimes meat or honey cakes. These events reinforce morale, loyalty, and collective pride. They also reinforce the state's role as provider. Even without coin-based wages, Egypt's laborers understood they were being fed, housed, and honored by a system much larger than themselves. And that system had layers. At the top were royal administrators, often nobles, who oversaw agricultural planning and coordinated with temple estates. Below them were local officials, sometimes from the same villages as the workers, who managed ration flows and ensured fair distribution. The laborers themselves were grouped into gangs, crews, and files, shifts, each with a team leader responsible for discipline and efficiency. Food distribution reinforced this structure. Leaders received their crew's daily allocations and were held responsible for how it was divided. This accountability created an incentive for internal harmony. If one worker ate more than his share, it reflected on the entire crew. If tools were lost or jars broken, it was logged against the group's name. And the crews, in turn, built identity around this shared burden. Carved graffiti inside the pyramids and nearby quarries includes phrases like "Team of the Drunkards, Servants of the Rock," "Left Side Builders," sometimes accompanied by simple drawings, stick figures with loaves, jars, or tools. These inscriptions weren't acts of rebellion. They were quiet badges of belonging. The daily routine of eating and working shaped these bonds. At sunrise, workers gathered for their first ration, usually bread and beer. After hours of hauling, dragging, and chiseling, a second ration came midday. By dusk, work ceased. Evening meals were eaten in common courtyards, near fire pits, surrounded by low walls and flickering lamps, laughter, exhaustion, and maybe the last dregs of the day's beer. It was a rhythm far removed from our image of slaves whipped beneath whirling sun. It was organized, difficult, and surprisingly human. But what happened to this system when the pyramids were finished? What did the bread makers and beer brewers do when the stones stopped moving? When the final blocks were laid and the last ramps dismantled, the massive workforce that had fed, hauled, carved, and recorded for decades began to dissolve, not into disappearance but into redistribution. The pyramids may have ended, but the system that fed them did not. Many of the same laborers who built the royal tombs returned to their home villages, bringing with them new skills in organization, craftsmanship, and construction. Some became local foremen, organizing irrigation projects or granary expansions. Others applied their masonry to smaller temples or helped repair canal systems. Their training on the royal payroll gave them a kind of unofficial credential. They had served the pharaoh, and the infrastructure built to feed them, the bakeries, breweries, storage buildings, didn't vanish. Many were repurposed. A bakery might become a village oven. A storeroom could be converted into a residence or temple outbuilding. The design principles remained. So did the habits. Bread and beer, once symbols of state planning, became part of daily domestic life across Egypt. While upper-class homes used refined flour and imported spices, most people still ground emmer, grain on horizontal stones, still baked in clay molds, still brewed murky beer in sun-warmed pots. The legacy of pyramid rations lived on in standardization. Even after the Pyramid Age, state workers on other royal projects, such as canal dredging, temple building, or military expeditions, were issued similar food allocations. A daily count of loaves, a measure of beer, a portion of onions or pulses. The Wilbur Papyrus, dating to centuries later, shows a continued reliance on food-based compensation systems, complete with calculations of who owed what and how many people each field could feed. It wasn't money that moved Egypt. It was calories, and these calories had to be measured. Even long after pyramid building ceased, the scribe remained central to this system. At building sites, scribes stood with reed pens and scrolls, tracking consumption and deliveries. In villages, they marked grain dues owed by farmers. At temples, they oversaw the sacrificial food that sustained not just humans, but gods, because the gods too were fed. Every day, temple priests offered ritual meals to the gods, plates of bread, beer, vegetables, and meat. These offerings were not always consumed. Instead, they were redistributed to the temple staff, reinforcing the sacred role of food, not just as fuel, but as symbol. Even the dead were fed. Grave goods often included model loaves, beer jars, and clay images of cattle. In the afterlife, as in life, nourishment meant protection. The bureaucracy that fed pyramid builders had long-reaching effects. It showed Egypt's rulers that large-scale labor could be coordinated, that complex systems could function across time and terrain. The principles used at Giza were adapted to other state projects, expanding irrigation ditches, building temples at Karnak, or maintaining roads across the desert to Nubia. All of it required the same quiet logistics: grain measured and milled, bread shaped and baked, beer brewed and stored, rations tracked and delivered, crews organized and accounted for. It was a civilization powered by ledgers and ladles. This organization also offered resilience. During times of hardship, drought, crop failure, civil unrest, the systems that once fed pyramid crews helped distribute stored food to broader populations. Royal granaries, initially built to support monument construction, became emergency stockpiles. In some periods, inscriptions record that the grain of the king fed the people, reinforcing the image of the pharaoh as not just builder but sustainer. Even as political power shifted, through invasions, dynastic changes, and cultural fusion, the model remained. The basic practice of labor for rations persisted through the New Kingdom and into later periods. Foreign rulers adopted it. Temple economies used it. Farmers expected it, and the food itself changed little. Bread remained coarse, beer remained cloudy, and both remained central to Egyptian life well into the Roman period. So central, in fact, that Roman tax records for Egypt list grain allocations for public projects, not in coin, but in weight of loaves. This is the unglamorous continuity beneath Egypt's famous grandeur, not gold or gods, but grain. When visitors today stand before the pyramids, they marvel at scale and precision. But beneath their feet once stood something just as vital: bakery ash, fish bones, broken beer jars, footprints in clay courtyards. These were the human traces of a project that was never just architectural, it was nutritional. Even now, archaeologists use the remains of bread molds, beer vessels, and grain husks to understand ancient diets. Some of these tools bear fingerprints. Some carry faint traces of flour. Some still smell, faintly, of smoke and age. They are not treasures, but they tell a deeper story: that Egypt's greatest achievements rested on full stomachs, measured rations, and the ability to turn barley into bricks. The builders of the pyramids left no memoirs, no epic songs. They left bread ovens, and those ovens, still crumbling in the sand, whisper of a society that understood one thing above all: to build something eternal, you must first feed the hands that build. If the builders of ancient Egypt worked with mud and stone, the scribes worked with silence. You won't find them standing on scaffolds or hauling bricks. You'll find them seated, legs crossed, stylus in hand, hovering over papyrus scrolls or shards of pottery. Quiet, precise, and unassuming, these scribes were the hidden architects of Egypt's long memory. And unlike the pyramids or temples, their greatest achievement wasn't built with labor, it was preserved with language. The profession of scribe was one of the most respected roles in ancient Egyptian society. While most people worked in the fields or on construction crews, a tiny fraction, perhaps 1 or 2% of the population, could read and write. These were the men, and in rare cases women, who managed records, measured fields, copied rituals, and corresponded on behalf of kings, priests, and merchants. But their tools were humble. A wooden pallet, notched to hold cakes of red and black, ink, a bundle of reed pens sharpened to a point, a water pot, and the writing surface. Either papyrus, painstakingly made from sliced river reeds pressed and dried, or ostraca, pottery shards used for informal drafts, notes, or lists. These tools sat in quiet corners of temples, granaries, workshops, and homes. Unlike oral traditions, which fade and shift, the scribe's work lasted. A note carved on stone could endure for millennia. A papyrus scroll, when stored in dry desert conditions, could remain legible thousands of years later. The very act of writing in Egypt was seen not just as recording, but as fixing truth. To inscribe something was to give it permanence. And yet these scribes did not write for art's sake. They wrote for function. The Egyptian state needed to know how much grain had been harvested, how many cattle were owned by which village, who had paid their temple taxes, and which workers showed up at dawn. The scribe's job was to make the country legible. At construction sites, they tracked deliveries of tools, measured stones, recorded labor rosters. At temples, they wrote hymns, copied sacred texts, kept records of offerings. In the court, they handled correspondence, archived proclamations, and maintained royal genealogies. Some specialized in legal documents, contracts, inheritances, land disputes. Others worked in medicine, transcribing treatments for fever, injury, or childbirth into scrolls that might be copied and used in distant towns. Still others preserved myth, history, and instruction, like the famous Instructions of Ptahhotep, a guide to ethics and leadership written over 4,000 years ago. But to become a scribe was no simple task. Training began in childhood. Those destined for scribal work were often born into scribal families, learning from their fathers or relatives. Education was formal, often conducted within temple precincts or special schools known as the House of Life. There, a student learned not just to write, but to copy exactly. Egyptian writing was not alphabetic, but logographic, using symbols to represent sounds, words, or concepts. Hieroglyphs, the most formal style, were complex and artistic. Hieratic, a cursive form, was faster and used for most everyday work. Mastery of both was essential. The early years were filled with repetition, copying lines, memorizing forms, practicing under supervision. Mistakes were corrected, styluses were resharpened, scrolls were copied and recopied, not to invent, but to preserve. Creativity came later, and only within boundaries. Some students complained. One famous text, the Satire of the Trades, has a teacher mock other jobs to his pupil. A scribe does not carry a hoe. He is not covered in clay. He commands others and is not commanded. The message was clear. Writing offered dignity if you had the discipline, and with that discipline came access. Scribes entered places others could not. Temple archives, royal halls, courtrooms. They could read messages from the king. They could reply. They could change a man's fortune with a mark of ink. Their voices were not loud, but their influence was foundational. Yet they remained anonymous. Few scribes are known by name. Most did not sign their work. Their labor was hidden beneath the surface of administration, as necessary and invisible as the lines beneath a painted mural. Occasionally, A statue or tomb inscription mentions a chief scribe of the granaries, or overseer of scribes in the house of life. But these are rare. More often, what survives are the records themselves. Letters to provincial governors, notes about stolen livestock, grain tallies, temple rosters, legal contracts carved into stele, all composed by scribes whose names were never preserved, but whose handwriting endures. And even in handwriting, there was personality. Modern scholars can sometimes identify individual scribes by their pen strokes, the way they shaped certain glyphs, how their ink pooled, how their lines curved or sharpened. One might press hard, making thick marks. Another might drift toward the right margin as he wrote. These are human details, locked in clay and fiber. Even more remarkable is how little the scribal system changed. For over 2,000 years, scribes used the same tools, the same training, and in many cases, the same words. A land grant written in 1500 BCE looks strikingly similar to one from 500 BCE. The symbols shift slightly, the handwriting varies, but the structure, language, and purpose remain intact. This continuity was not stagnation, it was intentional preservation. Egypt prized stability over innovation. The scribe's role was not to create new truths, but to protect old ones. But what happened when truth needed to change? When a new dynasty rewrote history, or a pharaoh's name was erased? What did the scribes do then? In a world that held the past sacred, the ancient Egyptian scribe also had to serve the present, and sometimes that meant rewriting it. While much of a scribe's duty was copying existing texts and preserving state records, there were moments when history itself was revised. Pharaohs fell out of favor, dynasties shifted, foreign rulers ascended, and in those quiet, uncertain moments, it was the scribes, those calm, precise hands behind the ink, who carefully reshaped the written memory of Egypt. Sometimes this meant erasure. A fallen ruler's name might be scraped from monuments, his image chiseled away from walls. This practice, known as damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, was not just symbolic, it was administrative. A name erased from stone might be removed from legal records, burial rites, or temple rituals. It was the closest thing Egypt had to unwriting a life. But someone had to do the chiseling, and someone had to mark the change in the ledgers. Scribes, who had once recorded the offerings to that ruler's tomb, now documented its closure. They altered royal lists. They reissued proclamations under new seals. Some may have disagreed, others obeyed in silence. Their role was not to judge, but to ensure that what was written matched power. Yet even in these moments of revision, scribes did not destroy all. Many simply covered old names with plaster, or replaced them with new ones. In tombs where names were hacked away, traces often remain, suggesting that even erasure was done with hesitation, because to a scribe, writing had weight. Every symbol carried not only sound, but meaning, and to remove a name from stone was to cut it from time. Still, history moved forward. During periods of foreign rule, Hyksos, Nubian, Persian, Greek, the scribes continued. They translated, they adapted. Greek texts were copied alongside hieratic. Later, Coptic began to appear. Yet throughout, Egyptian scribes held fast to the belief that the written word was order and their job was to uphold it. At the Temple of Karnak, one scribe recorded the regnal years of over 60 kings. Another, working centuries later, carefully annotated his scrolls with notes about corrections and scribal traditions. These weren't historians. They were recorders of rhythm. Their focus was not on why events happened, but when, and in what sequence, and under which name. This focus on structure extended to scribal materials themselves. Papyrus scrolls were often labeled at both ends, rolled tightly, and stored in jars or reed baskets. In larger temples and palace libraries, scrolls were organized by category: legal, religious, instructional. Titles were sometimes written along the edge for easy identification, and some archives, like the one at Amarna, housed hundreds of documents, letters, inventory lists, treaties, arranged by content and recipient. Even within a single scroll, formatting mattered. Titles were often written in red ink, main texts in black, margins were spaced according to tradition, columns were aligned, mistakes were either crossed out or rewritten entirely. Some scribes made practice scrolls, duplicating the same phrase over and over to perfect spacing and symbol clarity. These drills were as meticulous as any stonemason's measurement, and just as important. Because a scroll might travel across Egypt, it might pass from priest to overseer, from court to temple. If the writing was unclear, or if an official misread a unit of grain or a village name, the result could be confusion, or worse, punishment. Thus, scribal precision was not just cultural, it was administrative survival. But beyond temples and courts, scribes were also educators. In villages, scribes taught children basic writing and math. They used ink boards, thin slabs coated with a wash of plaster, to practice hieroglyphs or numerals. Lessons were short, repeated often, and focused on utility. A child didn't learn to write for poetry. He learned to count grain, measure, land, and record debt. The ancient Egyptian system of math, based on multiples of 10, allowed for easy calculation of goods and labor. Fractions, while complex in their notation, were used for dividing bread, beer, or field shares. Scribes needed not only to record these divisions, but to verify them in practice. This combination of writing and math made the scribe indispensable. During festivals, they recorded offerings by weight. During harvests, they noted field yields by square cubit. In court, they testified to the accuracy of wills and land claims. And at death, they prepared the inscriptions that would guide a soul into the afterlife. These inscriptions weren't generic, they were tailored. A man might request a prayer to Osiris, a blessing of safe passage, or a listing of his titles and good deeds. The scribe would compose, edit, and then write these lines onto tomb walls or coffins. Some of these texts, the pyramid texts, the coffin texts, the Book of the Dead, are famous today, but in their time, they were part of a daily scribal practice. And in each case, the goal was not novelty. It was correctness. A single glyph misplaced could shift meaning. A god's name misspelled could cause offense. A phrase left incomplete might leave a soul wandering. The pressure was not theatrical, but spiritual. And the scribes, as always, wrote in silence. We have few accounts of their personalities. No memoirs, no journals. Yet their work surrounds us, in museums, in tombs, on crumbling walls. The ink has faded, the papyrus curled, but the message remains. This is what happened. This is who was there. This is what mattered enough to write down. But what happened when writing was no longer enough? When memory passed not through scrolls, but through forgetting. As Egypt moved into its final centuries of ancient rule, the scribes continued writing, but their voices grew quieter, and their tools began to change. Foreign rulers came and went, dynasties faded, languages shifted. Still, the ink flowed. Yet even in their persistence, the scribes must have known not everything could be remembered. Some truths would be overwritten, others would be forgotten not by force, but by time. It began with language. As the Greek-speaking Ptolemies took the throne, the traditional scripts, hieroglyphic and hieratic, were joined by demotic, a newer, simplified writing system adapted to everyday needs. Demotic was practical, faster to write, and less artistic than its predecessors. For temple, rituals, and sacred texts, scribes still used hieroglyphs. But for tax receipts, land leases, and legal disputes, demotic took over. And later, during the Roman period, Coptic emerged, an alphabet based on Greek, with added characters to represent Egyptian sounds. It was used by Christian scribes, many of them working in monasteries instead of temples. These new scribes wrote prayers, hymns, and religious commentaries in the same land where once their ancestors had recorded hymns to Ra and field taxes for the harvest. With each shift in language came a shift in what was preserved. Old religious texts were copied less. Legal formulas were rewritten. Even the shapes of letters changed. And over time, fewer people learned how to read the ancient forms. By 400 CE, hieroglyphs were rarely taught outside of priestly circles. By the 6th century, they had vanished from living knowledge. The last known hieroglyphic inscription dates to 394 CE, carved on the wall of the Temple of Philae. After that, silence. It wasn't until the 19th century, with the discovery of the Rosetta Stone and the painstaking work of Jean-François Champollion, that scholars began to unlock the meanings of those ancient symbols again. But for over 1,000 years, the words of Egypt's scribes lay mute, visible but unreadable. In this, there's a paradox. The very precision that made Egyptian writing powerful also made it fragile. A symbol unread is a symbol unspoken. A grammar forgotten is a message sealed. For all their efforts to preserve truth, the scribes could not prevent its burial under centuries of change. Yet their legacy did endure. Not in the specifics of syntax or script, but in the habits they formed. The reverence for record-keeping, the blending of language and math, the idea that writing could outlive the writer. These habits shaped the administration of every regime that followed. Greek and Roman scribes adopted Egyptian accounting systems. Coptic monks preserved temple architecture by repurposing its walls. Even Islamic-era officials, centuries later, wrote their records in ways that echoed ancient formats. Date, name, weight, quantity, verification. In rural communities, echoes of scribal culture persisted too. Storytelling filled the silence left by unreadable texts. Oral histories, family traditions, proverbs, all carried fragments of the world view once recorded in ink. A farmer counting sacks of grain might not use the cubit rod anymore, but the logic remained. What is measured must be remembered. And in hidden corners of old temples, graffiti endured. Visitors, some pious, some playful, scratched their names, thoughts, or prayers into ancient walls. Some in Greek, some in Arabic, some in Coptic, and even a few in the old forms. A line of demotic scrawled beside a pharaoh's cartouche. A child's name carved beneath a hymn to Isis. These weren't official records. They were human continuities, AEA, whisper from one hand to another across time. Even now, Egypt's scribal legacy informs how we study the past. Modern archaeologists treat sites like libraries of silence. Each ostracon, each ledger fragment, each scroll speaks not just to content, but to context. Where it was written, why it was preserved, who had access, who did not. A scribe's brief note about a shipment of bricks becomes, for us, a window into labor practices. A receipt for fish becomes a hint at diet and trade. A scratched out line in a ledger tells us about correction, oversight, and pride in precision. In their time, these scribes didn't call themselves historians, but they are the reason history exists. Their quiet labor kept Egypt legible, not only for their kings and temples, but through extraordinary fortune for us. And that is the beauty of scribal work. It asks for no attention, but it grants understanding long after its hand has vanished. One might wonder, did the scribes ever imagine us? Did they know that one day their symbols would be rediscovered, reread, reinterpreted? Probably not. They wrote because it was their duty, because the scroll needed to be filled, because the overseer was waiting, because the field had been measured and the grain had to be tallied. But in doing so, they wrote for time itself. Today, in climate-controlled rooms beneath museums, their scrolls lie flattened under glass. Scholars lean close. Children walk by. None of it was written for this moment. And yet, it still speaks. Not loudly, not urgently, but with the same calm exactness that once filled the halls of the House of Life. It says, "I was here. I saw. I wrote it down." Long before the first hourglass trickled its sand or the first bronze sundial cast its shadow, the ancient Egyptians looked up at stars, at sunrises, at the slowly turning heavens above the desert. In a world without mechanical clocks, time was not heard. It was seen, and the desert was the perfect backdrop. With its vast, cloudless skies and near total absence of artificial light, Egypt's night offered one of the clearest views of the cosmos in the ancient world. Each night, the stars traced their predictable arcs from horizon to horizon, and the Egyptians, ever attuned to patterns, began to watch, to record, to organize, and eventually, to tell time. But timekeeping in ancient Egypt wasn't simply about measurement, it was about order. The very word the Egyptians used for the universe, ma'at, meant more than truth or justice. It meant balance, the harmonious rhythm of natural forces. And time, like the stars, had to be kept in that rhythm. When the stars were in their proper places, the floods came on time, the crops ripened, the festivals aligned. When they weren't, something was off. Not just in the sky, but in the world. The earliest evidence of Egyptian astronomy dates back to the Middle Kingdom, though it likely began much earlier. On the ceilings of tombs and temples, especially those belonging to kings and priests, one finds star charts called diagonal star tables. These aren't maps in the modern sense, but timekeeping tools. Each chart lists a series of stars, likely from a group known as the deacons, which rose just before dawn at specific times of the year. By tracking which star appeared on which night, priests could measure the passage of time in 10-day increments. 36 deacons divided the year into 360 days, with 5 additional festival days completing the full Egyptian year. These star tables weren't used for navigation. They were calendars written in the sky, and they had practical applications. In temples, priest astronomers, known as hour watchers, would observe the night sky to determine the correct time to begin rituals. In some temples, stone structures were aligned with specific stars or solstices, ensuring that light entered a chamber at exactly the right time of year. But most importantly, star rising signaled the great inundation of the Nile. The heliacal rising of Sopdet, the star we now call Sirius, marked the Egyptian New Year and the onset of Akhet, the flood season. Sopdet's rising just before dawn was so consistent, so closely tied to the rhythm of agriculture, that it became a central anchor of the Egyptian calendar. And yet the Egyptians didn't view these events as mechanical. They saw them as divine. Sopdet was not just a star, she was a goddess, bringer of fertility, herald of floodwaters, wife of Osiris, mother of Horus. Her appearance in the eastern sky was a renewal, a cosmic breath that realigned heaven and earth. The scribe might record her rising, but the priest sang to her. The farmer waited for her. The calendar turned because of her. But not all timekeeping occurred at night. During the day, the Egyptians relied on the sun's position. Sundials, simple and functional, were among the earliest daytime clocks. The oldest known Egyptian sundial, dating to around 1500 BCE, is a flat limestone slab with hour lines marked on its surface. A vertical stick, the gnomon, cast a shadow to indicate the time of day. But sundials had limitations. They didn't work indoors. They didn't help at night, and they couldn't track the hours of darkness. For that, the Egyptians invented the merket. A merket was a timekeeping instrument used with a plumb line and a sighting bar. When positioned correctly, it allowed the observer to align with a fixed star and track the movement of others. By watching how stars crossed a specific line, hour watchers could estimate how much time had passed after sunset. With practice, they could divide the night into 12 parts, which, unlike modern hours, varied in length depending on the season. That meant the Egyptian hour wasn't always 60 minutes. In summer, when nights were short, the 12 hours of darkness passed quickly. In winter, they stretched longer. The same was true of daylight. Time was fluid, shaped by the sun's presence, not by a ticking mechanism. Even so, the concept of dividing the day and night into 24 units, 12 for each, originated here. And these divisions weren't just academic. They mattered for ritual, labor, and navigation. A priest might begin a purification rite at the 2nd hour of the night. A farmer might begin ploughing at the 3rd hour of the morning. A messenger leaving for a distant town might be told to return by the 6th hour, even though that hour would vary with the season. Time in Egypt was not uniform. It was situational, and this situational awareness extended to architecture. Some temples, like those at Karnak and Dendera, were oriented with remarkable precision to celestial events. A shaft of sunlight illuminating a statue, a doorway aligned with the solstice. These were not accidents. They were deliberate acts of synchronization between built space and cosmic order. So when a priest walked into a sunlit chamber, he wasn't just entering a room. He was stepping into a moment calibrated by stars. But what happened when clouds came, when stars were hidden and water stood still? How did timekeepers work without light? When clouds gathered or desert winds swept in with dust and haze, Egypt's celestial order dimmed. The stars disappeared, the moon blurred, the sun dulled. In a land where the heavens were both calendar and compass, even brief interruptions to the sky demanded adjustment, not panic. Because while Egyptian timekeeping revered the stars, it was built with redundancy in mind. And that's where ritual, routine, and memory stepped in. Time in Egypt was never solely visual. It was also practiced, embedded in daily rhythms, chants, duties, and tasks. In temples, priests didn't require perfect visibility to know when a ceremony began. They knew how many verses of a hymn marked an hour, how many torch relights matched the length of a night vigil. They moved through structured time even when natural cues failed. This was particularly true during Egypt's frequent sandstorms, especially in desert regions near Thebes or in the western oases. Winds could rage for hours or days, masking the sun entirely. And still, temples opened. Offerings were made. Scribes noted the passage of days even without stars above them. The Egyptians understood that consistency, not precision, was the foundation of order. In the absence of a visible sky, they relied on water clocks or clepsydras, stone or ceramic vessels designed to allow a steady drip of water from a small hole. As the water level dropped, time passed. Markings on the interior walls indicated the hours, sometimes with symbols or hieroglyphs corresponding to different parts of the day or night. These clocks were not exact. Temperature, wear, and water quality could affect flow, but they worked well enough for scheduling prayers or changing guard shifts. The Egyptians didn't need perfect time. They needed predictable rhythm. In temple contexts, timekeeping was about alignment with the sacred, not tracking minutes. And so, the tools reflected this balance between utility and symbolism. A water clock shaped like a lotus, a sundial carved with symbols of Ra, a merket inscribed with a prayer to Seshat, goddess of writing and time. These instruments were not just tools. They were expressions of belief, and the belief was simple, that time, like the cosmos, was part of Ma'at, the universal balance. It could be read in the sky, felt in the day's rhythms, or chanted through prayer. As long as people kept pace with the divine pattern, the Nile would rise, crops would grow, and life would remain in order. But even outside temples, this sense of time infused everyday Egyptian life. In villages, people didn't track hours with clocks. They watched the shadows of doorways, the movement of cattle, the cooling of ovens. A boy might be told to return when the sun touches the western wall. A woman might know it was time to knead dough when her shadow grew longer than her breadboard. This was experiential time, understood not by number, but by change. In the marketplace, stall owners might begin selling at the first heat, break, during the second shade, and pack up at the wind's turn. These markers weren't universal. They varied by region, season, and trade. But they were reliable because they were observed generation after generation. And when cloud or dust obscured the usual signs, people turned to sound: temple bells, rooster calls, the pacing of workers, the splash of water jars filled and emptied. Each noise had its place in the rhythm. Even silence had meaning. At midday, during the sun's highest point, many tasks paused. It was a moment of stillness, heat, and reverence. These rhythms became especially important during festivals and agricultural cycles. The sowing season had its own cadence: ploughing, planting, irrigation, rest. The harvest followed a strict order: cutting, bundling, winnowing, measuring. At each stage, the scribe recorded, the priest blessed, the farmer worked, and all followed a time that was both celestial and seasonal. Calendars hung in temples, and elite homes showed major festivals, feast days, and seasonal markers. But most people didn't need scrolls to know when it was time to prepare for the Feast of Opet or the Wag Festival. The land told them. The river told them. The repetition of life told them. Still, some timekeepers wanted more than approximation. By the New Kingdom, more advanced clepsydras had been developed, some with complex inner chambers to regulate flow more evenly. A notable example comes from Karnak, a large alabaster water clock shaped like a bowl, with carefully etched hour, lines and inscriptions naming its creator. These were likely used by priests for nighttime rituals when the stars were obscured, or by astronomers tracking planetary movements. In parallel, some temples adopted astronomical ceilings, painted vaults showing constellations, zodiac signs, and planetary deities. These weren't functional in the modern sense, but they captured the Egyptian desire to tie architecture, religion, and time into one seamless vision. But even with all these tools, what defined Egyptian timekeeping wasn't technology. It was attentiveness. A temple aligned with Sirius, a bread batch timed to the sun's angle, a scroll noting that, at the rising of the third star, the chant begins. These weren't isolated acts. They were part of a culture that saw time as a partnership between nature, labor, and the divine. And, like the desert sand, that partnership could shift. It could obscure. But it never disappeared. Because if the stars failed to shine, the people still remembered their places. If the sun failed to cast a shadow, the priests still knew the prayers. And if the clock failed to drip, someone would still count the heartbeats between chants. But what happened when the old rhythms no longer matched the sky? When foreign ideas of time entered Egypt's temples? As Egypt passed through the hands of conquerors, Persians, Greeks, Romans, the concept of time itself began to shift. The stars still turned, the sun still rose, but the way Egyptians measured and understood time gradually moved from the rhythms of the natural world to the precision of imposed systems. At first, the changes were subtle. Greek influence brought the 12-hour day and 12-hour night into closer alignment with mathematical models. While Egyptians had already divided time this way, their hours fluctuated with the seasons. Greek timekeeping introduced the idea of equal-length hours, where each hour was the same no matter the time of year. This may seem minor, but for Egyptians, it was a departure from a world of fluid shadows and starlight into one of regularity and abstraction. Then came the sundials with fixed hour lines, imported or adapted to track this new standard. Some Egyptian artisans copied the form, producing hybrid devices marked with both native and foreign symbols. Temple courtyards began to incorporate these instruments, particularly in urban areas influenced by Hellenistic architecture. But the deeper transformation wasn't in the tools, it was in how time was valued. In traditional Egyptian culture, time was cyclical. The year repeated. The gods renewed the world through rituals. Each flood echoed the last. Each festival was a turning of the same wheel. There was no rush forward, only return. Greek and Roman influence, by contrast, brought linear time, a timeline with beginnings and ends, with progress, deadlines, and calendars that marched rather than circled. This shift affected not only administration and labor, but belief itself. Over generations, Egyptian timekeeping was slowly standardized, increasingly regulated by civic planners rather than priests or sky watchers. Still, the old systems lingered. Astronomical ceilings continued to be painted. Water clocks remained in use. Priests still noted the heliacal rising of Sirius. In rural areas, farmers still watched shadows and listened to wind patterns. Old habits, especially those tied to harvests and floods, proved remarkably durable. Even as Coptic Christianity spread through Egypt, some of the ancient solar festivals were folded into new religious calendars. The Coptic New Year, for instance, coincides with the ancient rising of Sirius and the Nile's flood season. In this way, celestial time persisted beneath layers of theology and empire. Yet, by the end of the Roman period, the temples, once aligned so carefully with stars, began to fall silent, not from catastrophe, but from quiet disuse. Without royal patronage, the priesthood declined. With the spread of new religions and centralized Roman administration, local observatories were no longer essential to public order. In many cases, the temple structures themselves were repurposed, turned into churches, granaries, or left to the sand. And the priests, once trained to track every star's appearance, were replaced by clerks with wax tablets and decrees issued by distant emperors. But not all was lost. In Upper Egypt, near Dendera and Edfu, temples still stand with star maps carved into their ceilings. These carvings, deep, intricate, and filled with motion, are not myths. They are records of celestial calendars encoded into stone by those who believed time was sacred because it repeated. The Dendera zodiac, for example, shows constellations and decans, planetary movements and lunar phases, all entwined into a swirling cosmology. Though it is stylized and symbolic, it reflects centuries of observation and intimate understanding of the night sky. Today, some of these carvings remain partially exposed to moonlight, as they were meant to be. And when modern archaeologists, astronomers, or historians study these sites, they are not just learning about the past, they are stepping into a very different sense of time, one where seasons matter more than seconds, where a rising star signals renewal, where a temple isn't just a place, but a clock built in stone. Even now, Egyptian farmers use inherited methods for planting and harvesting, passed down not by watches or schedules, but by watching the land, the behavior of birds, the scent of the river, the feel of wind on the skin at dawn. This is not superstition. It is a kind of observational literacy, a memory of time not as measurement, but as experience. Meanwhile, modern Egypt sits beneath the same sky, above the crowded cities and long highways, above the neon and dust. The same stars move in the same arcs they once did, when the priests of Karnak marked the second hour of the night. But few look up. And perhaps that's the quiet loss in the march of timekeeping. From the natural to the mechanical, from the eye to the clock, we've gained accuracy, coordination, and global synchronization. But we've also lost something: the patient watching, the intimate relationship between sky and soul, the idea that time is something you honor, not just something you track. The ancient Egyptians understood this. They didn't just measure time, they aligned themselves with it, and their tools, merkets, clepsydras, shadow lines on temple stones, are not relics of a primitive age. They are artifacts of attentiveness. They remind us that for thousands of years, before anyone wore a wristwatch, people rose with the stars, worked with the sun, and marked their lives not by what time it was, but by what time it felt like. That too is a form of timekeeping. To walk through the painted halls of an ancient Egyptian tomb is to step into a world of color. Deep lapis blues, vivid ochres, soft greens, and jet blacks, all preserved across millennia on stone and plaster. But behind these luminous surfaces lies a quieter, more grounded story, one of measurement, management, and the quiet bureaucracy of color. Ancient Egypt was not only a land of stone, It was a land of formulas, formulas. Each pigment, each pot of paint, each bundle of dyed linen passed through the hands of makers who had learned not only the secrets of extraction, but the rules of proportion. Dyes and pigments were precious. They were not mixed with guesswork. They were counted, and the people who did the counting were not artists, but record keepers. The dye industry in Egypt stretched from the workshops of Thebes to the reed-lined shores of the Nile Delta. There, natural ingredients were harvested, crushed, boiled, and blended to create a palette used for tombs, temples, statues, and clothing. Every color had a source. Every source had a cost, and every cost had to be tracked. Take blue, for example. Egyptian blue, often considered the world's first synthetic pigment, was made by heating a mixture of silica, sand, copper compounds, often from malachite or azurite, and calcium carbonate with a bit of alkali. The process required high temperatures and careful timing. Too little heat, and the mix stayed dull. Too much, and it scorched. Once produced, the resulting glassy substance was ground into a fine powder and mixed with water or egg whites to form a paint. It was expensive, difficult to make in large quantities, and often reserved for important details. Divine crowns, sacred symbols, the lapis hair of the god Amun. So, the scribe kept a ledger. One scroll might read, 2 jars of blue sent to the tomb of Senhotep, east wall. 3 measures withheld for temple statue eyes. 1 broken jar discarded. The pigment itself might be brilliant, but its usage was measured in units, not splashes. Red. Ochre was easier to produce. Sourced from iron-rich clay, it was abundant and used more freely, on coffins, on sandals, in inscriptions. Yellow came from a similar clay, often found in the desert's dry valleys. Green was more complicated, sometimes a blend of blue and yellow, sometimes copper-based, sometimes derived from rare earths. Black came from carbon, charcoal or burned animal bone, white from gypsum or chalk. Each workshop had its own recipes, but they all followed the same principle, consistency. A color made once had to be made again, exactly the same, especially when used in murals or on royal regalia. Mismatched pigment wasn't just sloppy. It was a disruption of visual harmony and, by extension, of matte. And so, the dye maker was both craftsman and chemist. He tested batches, logged ratios, kept samples of dried pigment to match future mixtures. Many used small color tablets, clay rectangles daubed with different paints and labeled with symbols for the formula and materials used. These were not artists' swatches. They were reference tools, quality control, and behind the dye maker stood the overseer, often a scribe or temple official, tasked with monitoring output. How many linen bolts were dyed? How many lotus stems were needed for the purple batch? How many cakes of blue were ground down to half weight? Nothing escaped the ledger. Some records from the New Kingdom period detail shipments of pigment to distant work sites. 4 sacks red to Valley Tomb 19. 2 bundles of green, delayed due to Nile current. Reserve yellow held for Festival Pavilion. The colors moved by boat, by donkey, by foot. Each shipment tagged, weighed, and often accompanied by a duplicate receipt. 1 copy stayed with the maker, 1 with the recipient. A third, sometimes, was filed with the temple. Archives. It was a system that valued verification, not just creation, and color wasn't confined to paint. Dyed linen, used for both ritual and daily dress, was also managed carefully. Blue and red dyed cloth were associated with status, used in priestly garments, royal wraps, or festival sashes. The dyeing process required boiling cloth with plant-based colorants, madder root for reds, woad or indigo for blues. The fabrics had to be soaked, dried, and sometimes dyed again to deepen the shade. This meant time, and time meant labor, and labor meant cost. In one record, a scribe notes, 10 pieces linen dyed red over 6 days, 3 men employed. Wood. For boiling fires, 6 bundles. Another reads, blue robe completed for priest of Ra, not to be washed until second full moon, excess dye stored in sealed jar. The references to timing, not just quantity, are telling. Dyes faded, colors shifted with age, light, and moisture. Proper handling preserved hue. Mishandling wasted everything, and waste was unacceptable. Broken jars, spilled pigment, over-diluted dye. Each one was recorded and often penalized. Not harshly, but with deduction. A worker might lose a day's ration for careless storage. A shipment might be delayed if a jar arrived half empty. Oversight was constant, but not cruel. The goal was balance, not punishment. In this, Egypt's color economy mirrored its wider worldview. To see a temple wall glowing with blue and red is to see more than beauty. It is to see systems at work. Farmers gathering minerals, traders shipping ingredients, craftsmen mixing, scribes counting, overseers weighing, painters applying, and, behind it all, a quiet hum of accounting. Each hue was a decision. Each jar a number. Each number a mark in a ledger. But what happened when colors ran out? When the blue cracked? When the formulas changed? When a pigment failed? Cracked on, the wall, faded under sun, or turned the wrong hue? It wasn't simply a flaw in artistry. It was a signal to the system. And in Egypt, systems responded not with haste, but with documentation. Failed pigment was noted in the same way as spoiled grain or a broken tool. The scribe updated the ledger. Batch green, batch 6, flaked after drying. Reason, poor grind or bad mix. Repeat with older formula. The jar might be sealed and set aside. A sample scraped and kept for review. Mistakes were not buried. They were studied, because color, like grain, was a resource. It could not be wasted. The workshops, often attached to temples or royal construction sites, functioned like small bureaucracies. Walls were lined with pigment cakes, hanging bundles of plant dye, sealed amphorae, and clay labels indicating batch, date, weight. Inside, workmen ground minerals, strained liquid dyes, and stirred mixtures under the cautious gaze of overseers. Each morning began with inventory. A scribe would call out ingredients as workers lifted them from shelves. Malachite, red ochre, yellow clay, indigo paste. Everything was weighed on balance scales using stone weights marked in deben, the Egyptian unit of mass. Any leftover from the previous day was noted and compared against the list of planned usage. If something was missing, powder gone, dye spilled, it was logged, explained, and sometimes replaced with substitute materials. Egyptian coloring wasn't just chemistry. It was strategy. When high-quality ingredients were unavailable, recipes adapted. Instead of lapis lazuli imported from Afghanistan, artists might substitute a local copper-based pigment. Instead of crushed saffron, they might use a dyed yellow earth. These decisions weren't made by artists alone. They passed through scribes, priests, or supervisors, each of whom weighed the cost, both material and symbolic. Because color had meaning, not just hue. Blue wasn't just a pleasant tone. It symbolized fertility, rebirth, and the life-giving waters of the Nile. Green suggested regeneration and health. Red could mean energy, anger, or divine power depending on its use. Black stood for the underworld, but also for the fertile black soil of the floodplain. Yellow invoked the eternal, sun, gods, and unaging flesh. So when a pigment failed, it didn't just look wrong. It communicated wrong. This symbolic language made repair particularly delicate. If blue paint peeled from a god's headdress, it had to be reapplied with care. Not just matched, but re-sanctified. Workers might wait for the right day, chosen by a priest astronomer before repainting. They might recite invocations or burn incense before beginning. The color was not merely pigment, it was presence. And yet, the system remained practical. If a wall couldn't be fixed immediately, a record was made. Blue reserved, South wall, third register. Repair scheduled after equinox. The jar of pigment would be sealed, labeled, and set aside. Another scribe might make a note in a separate scroll for temple maintenance. In royal tombs, where walls stretched for hundreds of feet and involved thousands of painted scenes, the planning was immense. Colors were assigned before work began. Artists worked from drawings, often transferred to walls using red grid lines, some of which are still faintly visible today. The scribes recorded the progress. West chamber complete to line 7, blue and yellow satisfactory. Begin green application, next full moon. Color even shaped supply logistics. Dye plants had growing seasons. Minerals were seasonal exports. Indigo, for instance, required harvest, fermentation, drying, and transport. Its availability affected when certain cloths or wall sections could be colored. One letter from an overseer to a workshop states, "Delay blue linens for processional robes until next barge from the south arrives. Indigo short this season." This careful planning extended to ritual dress. Priests in temples wore specific colored garments on specific days. One scroll outlines first day, white linen for purity. Third day, red sash for power. Fifth day, blue drape for renewal, drape for renewal. Each of these items had to be prepared, cleaned, dyed, and delivered in time for ritual. The dye maker wasn't present at the altar, but his ledger guided the act, and there were times when the recipes themselves changed. Over the centuries, materials shifted. The Egyptian blue of the Old Kingdom gave way, in some places, to cheaper compounds. Trade patterns evolved. Foreign dyes appeared. Purple from Phoenicia, brighter reds from Asia Minor. Local artisans began experimenting. A scroll from the Ptolemaic period includes a rare note. New purple tested, strong scent, holds poorly, avoid on cloth. Scribes recorded successes and failures alike. Sometimes a dye was stronger but bled too easily. Sometimes a mineral paint darkened with time. These were not treated as disasters, but as lessons. Color was not just beauty. It was a controlled experiment in consistency. A formula that worked became a standard. One that failed was retired, its label scratched out, its number skipped. Each workshop kept sample jars, often tiny amphoras sealed with wax or cloth, marked with glyphs for content and date. These functioned as quality controls, backups, and legal references. If a patron claimed the wrong blue had been used in a mural, the artisan could point to the reference jar and say, "This is the blue assigned." This culture of documentation gave Egyptian art its enduring clarity. Thousands of years later, the colors still speak. Not because the pigments were magical, but because their application was methodical. Recipes were preserved, layers were consistent, symbols were placed with care. It was a visual system not of spontaneity, but of craft under guidance. And when that system frayed, when pigments changed, formulas shifted, or ingredients vanished, the scribes adapted. But always with notation, never with guesswork, which leads to the quiet question left behind in many of those fading painted walls. When a civilization decides what color the gods should wear, and who gets to mix that color, what happens when the records are gone? When the last colors were mixed and the final jars sealed, Egypt's great workshops did not collapse in a single moment. They faded slowly, layer by layer, like the very paint that once adorned tomb walls. And as empires rose and fell, the ledgers that tracked each measure of red ochre or bundle of indigo were put away, misfiled, forgotten, or left to dust. But color did not vanish. It persisted in robes worn at rural festivals, in painted ceilings, or of village chapels, in the vivid tiles of homes built centuries later. The formal state systems that once controlled color's production had shifted, but the memory of method lingered. A woman dipping linen into dye might not know the name of the scribe who once logged the pigment's weight, but she knew how long to soak, when to stir, how the dye should smell. That knowledge, tactile, quiet, and unwritten, was the final echo of the dye maker's ledger. In the later centuries of Egyptian history, under Roman and then Byzantine control, the temple workshops dwindled. Some were abandoned. Others were repurposed. A few became part of monasteries, where scribes copied religious texts on parchment with imported inks, bright reds, golds, even blues, though rarely with the same mineral complexity of their ancestors. The sacred use of colour became symbolic in different ways: red for martyrdom, white for purity. Purple, still difficult to make, was reserved for emperors or bishops. These traditions mirrored older practices, even if the theology had changed. The ritual role of colour had not disappeared, it had simply shifted hands. Still, traces of the ancient order endured. In some parts of rural Egypt, families maintained dyeing traditions passed down for generations, grinding local stones, boiling leaves, filtering plant pulp through cloth. They may not have called it Egyptian blue, but the technique was surprisingly similar. And in certain tombs, Roman period murals continued to use old palettes, proof that even under foreign rule, the craft had continuity. But with time, the formulas changed beyond recognition. Minerals once traded across empires became unavailable. Ingredients were replaced with more accessible alternatives. Methods were streamlined. Record-keeping, once rigorous and centralized, fragmented. Dye became a domestic task more than a state-managed operation. And the ledgers? The scrolls that once tracked every color's origin and use were no longer copied. Many were destroyed during the decay of temple libraries or lost in the fires of conquest. Some may still lie buried beneath silt and stone. Others survive only as references within other texts. Lines like the blue used at Karnak, measured by 10 parts copper and 4 parts sand, preserved not for their pigment value, but as cultural memory. To modern archaeologists, these losses are both poignant and practical. In excavations, small pigment cakes are found, crumbled red, dull green, the occasional brilliant blue. They are often accompanied by fragments of pottery with color smears, weighing stones, or mixing bowls. The context tells us they were used with care. But the exact recipe, the exact ratio? Often it's gone. Still, reconstructions are possible. In laboratories today, scientists replicate Egyptian pigments using descriptions from tombs and inscriptions, chemical analysis of residues, and experimentation based on what is known about ancient tools. Egyptian blue, for instance, has been successfully recreated and even studied for modern applications like cooling coatings and optical materials. The old formulas, it turns out, were not just clever, they were ingenious. Yet what stands out most is not the brilliance of the pigments, but the systems that supported them. A color is not just a mixture, it's a chain of actions, a request made, a material gathered, a quantity measured, a shipment logged, a tool prepared, a wall cleaned, a brush dipped, a hand steady, a scribe watching. Each painted god or royal robe was backed by a quiet force of human effort, coordinated, deliberate, unseen. This is why Egyptian art feels so unified, not because every artisan thought the same, but because they worked within shared frameworks, updated by experience and refined by record. The palette was not just physical, it was procedural. And now, in the silence of ruined tombs, the colors remain. Some have faded, some have peeled, but others shine with eerie vibrance, preserved in dry air and sealed chambers. When you look at them today, you're not just seeing red or blue. You're seeing choices made thousands of years ago, carefully, repeatedly, recorded in ink and remembered in practice. Even the mistakes, the mismatched greens, the flaking blacks, tell us something. They speak of workshops under pressure, of substitutes made when shipments didn't arrive, of choices taken with urgency, scribbled quickly in a margin. Use second batch, first spoiled. They are records, even in failure, and they remind us that every civilization depends, in the end, on those who mix, measure, and mark, not just the kings and gods, but the die makers, the recorders, the counters of color. So the next time you see a faded mural or a scrap of painted linen in a museum case, don't just admire the hue. Think of the ledger, the one that counted each jar, that noted the breakage, that scheduled the next shipment, that ensured that Ra's sun disk remained gold, that Osiris's skin stayed green, that Ma'at's wings were balanced in blue and red. Because behind Egypt's visual splendor was not just pigment, but precision. And so the stories fade into silence, just as they once did beneath layers of sand and stone. We've walked through narrow temple corridors and sunlit workshops. We've watched scribes etch truth onto clay, listened to the rhythm of water clocks ticking in sacred shadows, and followed the slow passage of pigment from riverbank to royal tomb. What seemed eternal, pyramids, gods, golden crowns, was, in reality, sustained by repetition, by record, by the quiet discipline of daily tasks. Time in ancient Egypt was not rushed, it moved with care. And so did those who shaped it. Whether counting jars of indigo or measuring bread for pyramid builders, these ancient people weren't inventing wonders for wonder's sake. They were surviving, refining, and repeating. They were advancing not with spectacle, but with systems, with ledgers, ropes, recipes, and observation. If you find yourself drifting now, let that be part of the lesson. History isn't always battles or kings. Sometimes it's a pair of hands grinding red clay. Sometimes it's a scribe bent over a scroll, recording the weight of green pigment. Sometimes it's the decision to wait for the rising of a star, even when the clouds don't part. If you enjoyed this journey through the quiet mechanisms of one of the world's oldest civilizations, take a moment to let us know. Leave a comment below, share your favorite story, or just drop an emoji of a star, a scroll, or a grain of sand. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next slow step through the forgotten corners of history. Until next time, rest well, and remember, sometimes the most advanced people are the ones who simply kept the best notes.